She fell for the mountain, man who destroyed her family. What happened next shocked the whole town. They said the fire was his fault. They said he burned a homestead and vanished into the high timber. Years later, a lone schoolteacher rides into the mountains during a winter storm and collapses in the snow. She wakes by lamplight in a rough cabin and sees the man every whisper warned her about. Outside, the wind howls. Inside, the truth begins to crack, because the man she was taught to hate saved her life, and the fire everyone blamed on him was never meant to spread. As church bells ring and jail keys rattle, a powerful timber boss hides a darker secret. The town wants blood, but she wants the truth. When the past finally comes to light, will justice mean revenge or the kind of forgiveness that changes everything forever? Drop a comment below and share which part of the world you're tuning in from today. If you enjoy stories like this, don't forget to subscribe for more. The gray winter morning hung heavy over Pine Ridge as the stagecoach rattled to a stop, its wooden wheels crunching against the frozen ground. Hallie Mae Hollis gripped her carpetbag tighter, drawing in a steadying breath before descending the coach's steep steps. The crisp mountain air bit at her cheeks, so different from the warmer valleys she'd left behind. "Watch your step there, miss," the driver called down, his voice gruff but kind. Hallie nodded her thanks, her boots touching down on soil she hadn't stood upon since she was a child. Her teaching certificate, carefully wrapped in oilcloth, pressed against her side in her coat pocket like a shield. The rail-end town hadn't changed much in 12 years. The same weathered buildings lined the single main street, though the mercantile had a fresh coat of paint. A telegraph office had sprung up where the old smithy used to be, its wires stretching toward the endless sky like black threads. "Why, if it ain't the Hollis girl." The words came from an older woman sweeping the boardwalk in front of the general store. Her eyes were kind, but held that familiar look of pity Hallie had grown weary of seeing. News traveled fast in small towns, and her arrival had clearly been anticipated. "Yes, ma'am," Hallie replied, straightening her spine. "I'm Hallie Mae Hollis." The woman's broom stilled. "Lord above, you're the spitting image of your mama. I knew Sarah well, God rest her soul." She shook her head slowly. "What brings you back to Pine Ridge after all this time?" Hallie lifted her chin slightly. "I'm to be the new teacher at the mountain school." The woman's eyes widened, and Hallie noticed how her gaze darted toward the distant peaks, where morning mist still clung to the timber like a shroud. The same peaks where smoke had once billowed black against the sky, where the logging fire had devoured everything Hallie had ever loved. "The mountain school?" The woman's voice dropped lower. "But that's awful close to where—" She stopped herself, color rising in her cheeks. "Close to where Logan Rourke lives." Hallie finished for her, keeping her voice steady despite the way her heart clenched at speaking his name aloud. "Yes, I'm aware." The woman clutched her broom tighter. "Ain't right, him still living up there after what he done. Some folks say he's gone wild as a mountain lion, hardly comes down except for supplies once in a blue moon." Hallie adjusted her grip on her carpetbag, unwilling to be drawn into gossip. "If you'll excuse me, I need to arrange lodging." The mercantile's bell chimed as she stepped inside, the familiar scents of coffee beans and leather goods washing over her. Mr. Peterson, the owner, was exactly as she remembered, tall and rail-thin, with wire-rimmed spectacles perched on his nose. "Miss Hollis," he greeted her warmly. "Welcome back to Pine Ridge. Martha's got a room ready for you upstairs, just like you requested in your letter." The room was small but clean, with a narrow bed and a window that looked out over the street. Hallie set her carpetbag down and removed her coat, her fingers trembling slightly as she hung it on a peg by the door. The floorboards creaked beneath her feet as she crossed to the window, looking out at the mountains that had haunted her dreams for 12 years. Sunday evening came swiftly, and with it an invitation to supper at Preacher Wilson's house. The modest home glowed with lamplight as Hallie approached, her boots crunching on the frozen path. Inside, the preacher's wife had laid out a feast: roasted chicken, mashed potatoes, and fresh-baked bread that filled the house with its warm aroma. "We're so pleased to have you join us, Miss Hollis," Mrs. Wilson said, passing her a bowl of green beans. "Though I must admit, we were surprised when the school board accepted your application. Teaching up in the mountains can be challenging." Hallie noted the careful pause before the last word. Around the table, other guests, the doctor and his wife, the banker and his daughter, exchanged glances that spoke volumes. "I heard Telly was seen just last week," the banker's daughter whispered, not quite quietly enough. "Logan Rourke, coming down from the high timber. Mama says he's got a beard now, wild as any mountain man's." Now, Preacher Wilson interrupted, his tone gentle but firm. "We don't traffic in gossip at this table." But his eyes, when they met Hallie's, were concerned. "Though, Miss Hollis, if you've any doubts about taking the position—" "I don't," Hallie said clearly, setting down her fork. "I'm qualified to teach, and those children need an education." The conversation turned to other matters, but Hallie felt the weight of unspoken words hanging in the air like smoke. After supper, she declined offers to walk her back to the mercantile, needing the solitude of the cold night air to clear her head. In her room, Hallie lit the lamp and carefully unwrapped her parents' Bible from its cloth covering. The leather was worn smooth from years of handling, the pages marked with her mother's neat notes in the margins. She opened it to her favorite passage, one her father had often read aloud during their evening devotions. "Be strong and of good courage," she whispered, running her finger along the familiar words. "Fear not, nor be afraid of them." Sleep came fitfully that night, filled with dreams of smoke and flame, of a young man's face twisted with guilt and grief. When dawn finally broke, painting the mountains in shades of pearl and gold, Hallie was already awake and dressed. Mr. Peterson had arranged for her to borrow a horse, a steady bay mare named Penny, for the ride up to the schoolhouse. Hallie checked the saddle straps carefully, just as her father had taught her long ago. The morning was bitter cold, her breath forming clouds in the air as she led the horse out of the stable. "You sure you want to head up there alone?" the stable hand asked, concern evident in his weathered face. "I could ride with you. Make sure you find your way." "Thank you, but no," Hallie replied, mounting with practiced ease. "I remember the way." And she did. Even after 12 years, her body remembered the rhythm of climbing these mountain trails, the way the air grew thinner and clearer with each switchback. Penny's hooves made a steady rhythm against the frozen ground as they climbed higher, leaving the sleeping town behind. The sun was fully up now, casting long shadows through the pines. Hallie kept her eyes fixed ahead, trying not to look at the blackened stumps that still dotted the landscape, silent witnesses to the fire that had changed everything. Somewhere in these mountains, Logan Rourke made his solitary home. The man who, according to every whispered account she'd heard since childhood, had started the fire that killed her parents. But vengeance wasn't what had brought her back to Pine Ridge. She'd come to teach, to help build something good in a place that had known too much sorrow. Still, as Penny carried her higher into the timber, Hallie couldn't help wondering if she would recognize him if their paths crossed. Would he know her? Would he remember the screaming girl who'd watched her world burn? The schoolhouse appeared around a bend in the trail, its simple log walls and shake roof a familiar sight from her own childhood days as a student there. Hallie reined Penny to a stop, taking in the sight of the place where she would now be teacher instead of pupil. Smoke rose from the chimney. Someone had already come to light the morning fire, and she could see fresh-cut firewood stacked neatly against the wall. This was why she had come back. Not for revenge, not to confront old ghosts, but to teach children who needed learning just as she once had. Drawing in a deep breath of the crystal-clear mountain air, Hallie straightened her shoulders and urged Penny forward. The key moments of her arrival played through her mind. Stepping down from the stagecoach, facing the whispers and stares, the heavy conversations at the preacher's table, and now this solitary ride up into the mountains she both loved and feared. She had chosen to return, chosen to face whatever waited in these hills. Whether that choice was brave or foolish remained to be seen, but it was made. As she dismounted and tied Penny to the hitching post, the sun finally broke through the morning clouds, setting the frost-covered ground sparkling like scattered diamonds. Hallie paused with her hand on the schoolhouse door, feeling the rough wood beneath her palm. Beyond these mountains, somewhere to the east, lay easier paths she could have taken. But she was Hallie Mae Hollis, daughter of homesteaders who had carved their dreams from this wild land, and she would not turn back now. The door creaked open at her touch, welcome heat from the pot-bellied stove washing over her. Inside, rows of simple desks waited for the children who would soon arrive, their surfaces scarred with the initials of generations of mountain students. Hallie walked to the teacher's desk at the front of the room, set down her books, and began to prepare for her first day of teaching in the shadow of all that had been lost. The mountain trail wound higher through stands of pine and aspen, their branches heavy with last week's snow. Hallie pulled her woolen coat tighter as another gust of wind cut through the fabric. The borrowed mare, Penny, picked her way carefully along the path, her hooves breaking through frozen crust with each step. "Steady now," Hallie murmured, patting the horse's neck as they navigated around a fallen log. The winter sun hung pale and distant in a pearl-gray sky, offering little warmth against the biting cold. The journey stretched longer than she remembered from her childhood. What had once been a quick morning ride now consumed most of the day, the snow-packed trail forcing them to move at a cautious pace. Twice they had to stop while Hallie cleared branches that had fallen across their path, her gloved hands growing numb despite her efforts to keep moving. By early afternoon, the schoolhouse finally came into view around a bend in the trail. The log structure stood solid against the mountain backdrop, smoke curling from its stone chimney. A smaller building connected to its eastern side, the teacher's quarters where she would live during the school week. As Penny approached the hitching post, the schoolhouse door swung open. 3 children burst out, their faces bright with curiosity. The oldest, a girl of perhaps 12, wore a faded calico dress and a worn wool shawl. Behind her, 2 younger boys hung back shyly. "Are you the new teacher, ma'am?" the girl asked, stepping forward with a mixture of boldness and proper manners. "I'm Sarah Cooper. These are my brothers, James and William." Hallie smiled, swinging down from the saddle. "I am indeed. Miss Hollis, at your service." She steadied, herself against a wave of dizziness from the altitude, not wanting to show weakness in front of her first students. "Were you the ones who lit the morning fire?" Sarah nodded proudly. "Pa says it's our job to keep the schoolhouse warm, being as we live closest." She gestured toward the valley. "Most families won't send their children up until spring proper on account of the weather." Speaking of weather, a deep voice called from behind them. A man in his 50s approached, leading a heavily laden pack horse. His beard was shot through with gray, his eyes creased from years of mountain sun. "Storm's coming in fast, Miss Hollis. Might want to head back down before it hits." Mr. Cooper? Hallie guessed, noting his resemblance to the children. He nodded. Just dropping off supplies for the teachers' quarters. But those clouds... He pointed toward the western peaks, where dark masses were building with unusual speed. They ain't natural. You'd best not linger. Hallie glanced at the threatening sky, then at the small cabin attached to the schoolhouse. I've brought provisions. Surely I could weather one storm? Not these storms, ma'am. Mr. Cooper's voice was grave. They come up quick and turn deadly. Best get back to town while you can still see the trail. The children's faces showed clear agreement with their father's warning. Hallie hesitated, but the rapidly darkening sky made the decision for her. She would have to postpone settling into her new home until tomorrow. Thank you for the warning, she said, checking Penny's saddle straps. I'll head back now, while there's still light. Mr. Cooper helped her mount, then handed her a small package. Sarah baked extra biscuits. You might need something warm in your stomach on the ride down. The temperature was already dropping as Hallie started back down the trail, the wind picking up strength with each passing minute. Dark clouds rolled over the peaks like a tide of ink, swallowing the weak winter sunlight. The first snowflakes began to fall, not the gentle drift of normal winter weather, but sharp pellets driven sideways by the wind. Penny grew increasingly nervous as the storm intensified, her ears laying flat against her head. Hallie could barely see 20 feet ahead through the thickening snow. The trail, so clear on their ascent, now seemed to fade into white nothingness. Easy, girl, Hallie soothed, though her own heart was racing. The wind howled through the trees, sending ice crystals stinging against her face. She pulled her scarf higher, but it offered little protection against the brutal cold. They reached a particularly narrow section of trail, with a steep drop-off to one side. Hallie leaned forward, trying to keep their weight balanced, as Penny picked her way forward. A sudden crack split the air, a tree branch breaking under its load of ice, and Penny reared in panic. Hallie fought for control, but the horse's fear was too great. The mare's hooves slipped on the icy ground, and Hallie felt herself thrown sideways. For one terrible moment, she was airborne. Then she struck something soft but brutally cold, a deep snowdrift that partially broke her fall. Pain shot through her right shoulder and hip as she struggled to sit up. Through the swirling snow, she caught a glimpse of Penny disappearing down the trail, running in blind terror. Hallie called out, but her voice was lost in the howling wind. She forced herself to stand, fighting waves of dizziness. Nothing seemed broken, but every movement brought fresh stabs of pain. The storm had reduced visibility to mere feet, and the temperature continued to plummet. She had to keep moving or freeze where she stood. Hallie began walking, using the steep slope to her left as a guide. Each step was a battle against wind and pain and growing confusion. The cold seemed to seep into her very bones, making thought difficult. She lost all sense of time, knowing only that she had to keep moving downhill, toward town, toward safety. But the storm showed no mercy. Her legs grew heavier with each step, and the pain in her shoulder had spread into a deep ache that seemed to fill her entire body. The world narrowed to white blur, broken only by the dark shapes of trees. "Please, Lord," she whispered through cracked lips, "help me find the way." As if in answer, her foot caught on something hidden beneath the snow. She pitched forward, too numb and exhausted to catch herself. The ground rushed up to meet her, and this time she couldn't find the strength to rise. Darkness crept in at the edges of her vision. Hallie fought to stay conscious, knowing that to sleep in this cold meant death. But her body had reached its limit. As her eyes drifted closed, she became aware of a new sound cutting through the storm's fury, the crunch of heavy boots in snow. Through half-closed eyes, she saw a tall figure approaching, beard crusted with ice, shoulders broad beneath layers of wool and fur. Strong arms lifted her carefully from the ground as consciousness slipped away like water through her fingers. Her last thought, before darkness claimed her completely, was a distant wondering. Savior or enemy? In these mountains, she was no longer sure she knew the difference. The wind howled on, erasing all tracks in the deepening snow, as the stranger carried her still form away from the trail and into the gathering night. Warmth. That was the first sensation that crept through Hallie's consciousness. Warmth and the crackling sound of a well-tended fire. She lay on something soft, a narrow bed, she realized, covered with quilts that smelled of pine smoke and herbs. Her eyes fluttered open to lamplight, casting dancing shadows on rough-hewn log walls. A hearth dominated one wall of the cabin, its flames pushing back the darkness and the howling storm beyond the walls. Her wet clothes had been replaced with a man's oversized flannel shirt over her undergarments, though she noticed, with relief, that her modesty had been preserved. Pain throbbed in her shoulder and hip where she'd struck the ground. Her head felt heavy, thoughts moving like molasses. How long had she lain here? The last clear memory was of falling in the snow, then being lifted by strong arms. A quiet movement drew her attention. A tall figure bent over the hearth, stirring something in an iron pot. Steam rose from the mixture, carrying the scent of willow bark and other herbs she couldn't name. The man's back was to her, his shoulders broad beneath a wool shirt, his movements careful and practiced. He turned slightly, reaching for a cup on the rough-hewn table, and Hallie caught glimpses of his profile in the uneven light. A strong jaw covered in dark beard, eyes intent on his task. There was something familiar about him that tugged at the edges of her memory, but fever made her thoughts slip away before she could grasp them. The cabin was small but orderly. Her gaze drifted to shelves lined with books, children's readers, medical texts, and a well-worn Bible. Bottles of medicine stood in neat rows, their labels carefully written in a steady hand. Who was this mountain man who kept medical supplies and school books? He approached the bed with quiet steps, holding a steaming cup. "You need to drink this," he said softly, his voice deep but gentle. "It will help with the fever." Hallie tried to sit up, but weakness made her arms tremble. Without a word, he slipped one strong arm behind her shoulders, supporting her weight as he held the cup to her lips. The bitter tea made her grimace, but she drank it all, understanding it was medicine. "The storm?" she managed to ask as he lowered her back against the pillows. "Still raging. Will be for another day at least." He moved away, his footsteps nearly silent despite his size. "Rest now. You're safe here." Something in his voice, something in the way he avoided meeting her eyes, sent a chill through her that had nothing to do with fever. She watched him more carefully as he moved about the cabin, tending the fire, checking supplies, always keeping his face turned away. Dawn's weak light began to seep through the cabin's small windows, painting everything in shades of gray. The man stepped fully into view at last, and in that moment, everything clicked into terrible focus. The broad shoulders she remembered from wanted posters. The dark beard townspeople had described in whispered warnings. The way he held himself. Careful, contained, like a man carrying a heavy burden. Horror rose in her throat as recognition struck. "Logan Rourke," she whispered, her voice shaking with fury and fear. He went absolutely still, like a deer scenting danger. Then slowly, so slowly, he turned to face her fully for the first time. "You're Hallie Mae Hollis," he said quietly. Not a question. The weight of recognition and old grief lay heavy in his voice. Hallie tried to push herself up, to get away, but her weakened body betrayed her. The room spun sickeningly. "You killed them," she gasped. "The fire, my parents." "You're safe here," he repeated, taking a step back, giving her space. His face was etched with something that might have been pain or guilt or both. "I give you my word." "Your word?" The laugh that burst from her was harsh, bordering on hysterical. The word of a murderer? Logan flinched as if she'd struck him, but he didn't defend himself, didn't deny her accusations. He just stood there, shoulders bowed, accepting her fury as if he'd expected nothing less. "The storm will last another day," he said finally, his voice low and controlled. "You're still weak with fever. Try to rest. When the weather clears, I'll take you down to town myself." "I don't want anything from you," Hallie spat, even as another wave of dizziness washed over her. She fought against it, but her body was betraying her, pulling her back toward unconsciousness. The last thing she saw before exhaustion claimed her was Logan Rourke, kneeling by the hearth, his head bowed in prayer, shoulders bent under the weight of old sins. Firelight caught the sides of his face, highlighting the deep lines of guilt carved there. She wanted to rage at him, to demand answers, to make him feel even a fraction of the pain she'd carried for 12 years. But darkness was already pulling her under, leaving her helpless in the home of the man who had destroyed everything she loved. Through the gathering shadows of unconsciousness, she heard his whispered words. "Lord, give me strength to do what's right, and give her the peace that's eluded her all these years." Then fever drew her down into restless dreams, while outside, the storm raged on, trapping predator and prey together in this mountain sanctuary until nature deemed otherwise. Logan remained by the hearth, praying in the growing light of dawn, as if seeking absolution for sins that no amount of penance seemed able to wash away. The fire crackled, throwing sparks up the chimney, a quiet witness to this unexpected reunion of two souls bound together by tragedy and the harsh mercy of mountain storms. The storm showed no sign of weakening as morning light filtered through the cabin's frost-covered windows. Hallie drifted in and out of consciousness, her fever finally breaking sometime before dawn. When she next opened her eyes, it wasn't Logan's imposing figure she saw, but a slight young woman with kind eyes and honey-brown hair pulled back in a neat braid. "There you are," the woman said softly, wringing out a cool cloth and placing it on Hallie's forehead. "I'm Martha Rourke, Logan's sister. He asked me to look after you while the storm passes." Hallie tensed at the name Rourke, but weakness kept her from pulling away. Martha's hands were gentle as she helped Hallie sit up against the pillows. "Where is he?" Hallie asked, her voice rough from sleep. "Logan's sleeping in the shed," Martha explained, stirring something that smelled like chicken broth in a pot by the hearth. "He thought you'd be more comfortable that way." The cabin looked different in daylight. Simple but clean, with dried herbs hanging from the rafters and carefully mended curtains at the windows. A woman's touch was evident in the small details, the pattern of the quilts, the arrangement of the few dishes on open shelves. Martha brought over a bowl of steaming broth. "You need to eat something," she said. "You've been through quite an ordeal." Hallie's hand shook as she took the bowl, but Martha didn't comment, just settled into a chair nearby with some mending. The broth was rich and warming, clearly made with care. "He's not what you think," Martha said after a while, her needle moving steadily through the fabric in her lap. "My brother, I mean. He's carried such weight these past 12 years. "Weight he earned," Hallie said sharply, but her voice lacked its earlier venom. Martha's hands stilled. There's more to that story than you know." She spoke gently, but with quiet conviction. "Logan's been nothing but kind to everyone in these mountains, even those who shun him, especially those who shun him." Through the day, Martha tended to Hallie with quiet efficiency, changing bandages on her twisted ankle, bringing fresh water and more broth. She spoke of life in the mountains, how Logan treated injuries and illness for any who asked, how he helped widows with firewood, how he taught children to read when they couldn't make it to the schoolhouse. Hallie listened despite herself, her certainty beginning to waver. The Logan Rourke that Martha described didn't match the monster she'd carried in her heart for 12 years. As evening approached, the wind rose to a howl, rattling the cabin's windows. Hallie lay awake, watching shadows dance on the walls. Voices drifted from the kitchen area. Logan had come in from the shed to speak with Martha. "The supplies are running low," Martha was saying, her voice worried, "and Wilson's demanding payment on the debt again." "I'll figure something out," Logan replied, his deep voice gentle. "We've been through worse." "Like that winter after the fire?" Martha's words were barely audible. "When we nearly starved." There was a long pause before Logan spoke again. "We survived. That's what matters." "Because you did what you had to do," Martha insisted. "What Crowell forced you to—" "Hush now," Logan cut her off, but not unkindly. "That's long past. Get some rest, Martha. Storm should break by morning." Hallie lay very still, their words echoing in her mind. What had Crowell forced Logan to do? The question nagged at her as she drifted into uneasy sleep. True to Logan's prediction, dawn brought clearing skies. Hallie woke to find her strength mostly returned, though her ankle was still tender. Martha helped her dress in clothes now dried by the fire, while Logan readied the horses outside. "You'll want to leave soon," Logan said from the doorway, not quite, meeting her eyes. "Trail down will be rough, but passable." He seemed to expect her hatred, accepting it as his due. Hallie nodded stiffly, gathering her few belongings. As she did, her gaze fell on a leather-bound ledger on the shelf, its spine worn with use. Something made her pause, reach for it. The pages were filled with careful records, names, dates, amounts. She recognized many of the names. Jenkins, who'd lost their farm in a flood. Williams, whose husband died in a mining accident. And there, her breath caught. Hollis. Her own family name, among dozens of others who'd received anonymous aid over the years. The amounts were significant, especially for someone living as simply as Logan did. How many winters had he gone hungry to help others? How many comforts had he denied himself to make these payments? Her hands trembled as she closed the ledger. When she looked up, Logan stood watching her, his expression unreadable. "Your horse is ready," he said quietly, as if he hadn't seen her discovery, as if he didn't know how it had shaken her world. Outside, the morning air was sharp and clean, the storm-washed sky a brilliant blue. Logan helped Hallie mount, his hands careful and impersonal. She looked down at him, this man who'd haunted her nightmares for 12 years, and found herself suddenly uncertain of everything she'd believed. The ledger's entries burned in her memory, dates stretching back 12 years, beginning just months after the fire that had claimed her parents. Regular payments, small at first, then growing as if driven by some desperate need to make amends. Martha stood in the doorway, worry evident in her face as she watched them. Logan checked Hallie's stirrups one last time, his movements efficient but gentle, still expecting nothing but her condemnation. Hallie gripped the reins, her heart pounding with questions she wasn't ready to ask. The certainty that had driven her up these mountains lay in pieces around her, shattered by what she'd seen in that ledger, by Martha's quiet words, by the weight of unspoken truth in Logan's shoulders. The morning sun caught the frost on the pines, turning the world to crystal. Below, the trail wound down toward town, toward what she'd always thought was justice. But now, sitting tall in the saddle while Logan made one final check of her horse's girth, Hallie wasn't sure what justice looked like anymore. The mountain trail wound down through patches of sunlight and shadow, hooves crunching in fresh snow. Logan rode slightly ahead of Hallie, scanning the path for hazards with the practiced eye of someone who knew every tree and turn. They traveled in silence, the only sounds their horses breathing and the occasional call of a winter bird. Every so often, Logan would glance back to check on her, his expression carefully neutral. Hallie found herself studying him when his attention was elsewhere. The broad set of his shoulders, the way he held himself both alert and somehow burdened, nothing like the monster of her memories. After 2 hours, they reached a familiar fork in the trail. Logan reined his horse to a stop, gesturing toward the wider path that led down to Pine Ridge. "Town's about 3 hours steady riding from here," he said, his deep voice matching the quiet of the forest. "Trail's clear enough you won't lose your way." Hallie nodded, suddenly uncertain what to say to this man who'd saved her life, this man she'd hated for so long. "Thank you," she managed finally. "For everything." Logan's hands tightened on his reins. "No thanks needed, Miss Hollis." He touched the brim of his hat, then turned his horse back toward the higher peaks. "Weather's turning again. Best get down before dark." She watched him disappear into the trees, his figure growing smaller until the forest swallowed him completely. The ledger's careful columns of numbers flickered through her mind. All those names, all that quiet giving. What kind of man did that sort of thing in secret, year after year? The afternoon sun was already sliding toward the mountains when Hallie finally rode into Pine Ridge. Word of her arrival spread quickly through the streets. Within minutes, a small crowd gathered outside the mercantile where she'd dismounted. "Miss Hollis!" Mrs. Peterson hurried forward, her usually neat hair wind-blown. "We've been sick with worry when your horse came back without you." "I'm fine," Hallie assured them, though her ankle still throbbed. "The storm caught me, but I found shelter." "Shelter?" That was Mr. Jenkins from the bank, his eyes narrowing. "Up in the mountains? Where exactly?" Before Hallie could answer, a commanding voice cut through the murmuring crowd. "Let the lady breathe, friends." Silas Crowell stepped forward, every inch the respected businessman in his fine wool coat. His smile was warm, but something in his eyes made Hallie think of a hawk studying its prey. "Miss Hollis," he said, taking her gloved hand in both of his. "What a relief to see you safe. We feared the worst when that storm hit. I trust you weren't too inconvenienced by your rescuer?" The way he said it made her skin crawl. She pulled her hand free as politely as she could. "Mr. Rourke and his sister showed me nothing but kindness." A ripple went through the crowd at Logan's name. Crowell's smile never wavered, but his eyes grew harder. "Ah yes, Rourke," he said, raising his voice slightly. "Some might say it's the least he could do, considering his history with your family, though it takes a special kind of nerve to stay up there all these years, so close to where he lit that fire." "Mr. Crowell," Hallie started, but he spoke over her, addressing the growing crowd. "Of course, we're all grateful he didn't add another tragedy to his conscience. Though one might wonder why a man with nothing to hide lives like a hermit in the high country, eh?" Murmurs of agreement rose from the townspeople. Hallie saw faces hardening, old anger stirring. Even Mrs. Peterson, who'd been so concerned moments ago, was nodding along with Crowell's words. Now, Crowell continued, his tone reasonable but carrying clearly to every ear. "We're all glad Miss Hollis is safe, But perhaps this is a reminder that some debts remain unpaid, some justice unfinished. Sheriff Hale pushed through the crowd then, his weathered face creased with concern. "That's enough speculation for one evening," he said firmly. "Miss Hollis needs rest, not gossip." The crowd began to disperse, but Hallie caught fragments of conversation as people moved away. "Always knew he was still up there. 12 years and not a word of sorry. Sheriff ought to do something." Hallie climbed the stairs to her room above the mercantile, her mind churning. The room was cold and dark, but she barely noticed. She lit the lamp with shaking hands and sank onto the narrow bed. Through her window she could hear voices from the street below. Groups of men gathered in the failing light, their tone angry and determined. Crowell's words had awakened something ugly, something that had been sleeping but never truly gone. She opened her carpet bag and drew out her parents' Bible, seeking comfort in its familiar weight. A scrap of paper fell from between the pages, the corner of a newspaper clipping she'd saved, documenting the fire. The words seemed different now, somehow less certain than they'd once been. What had Martha said? "There's more to that story than you know." And those whispered words about Crowell, about being forced to do something. The ledger entry started just months after the fire, as if driven by desperate guilt or desperate penance. Boots clattered on the boardwalk below. Hallie moved to the window, pushing aside the curtain. In the gathering darkness, she could make out a group of men mounting up, rifles gleaming dully in the lamplight. Sheriff Hale sat his horse at their center, his face grim. "We'll check the old cabin first," someone said, "then work our way up." 12 years is long enough," another voice added. "Time to finish this." The horses moved out, hooves drumming against the packed earth of the street. Hallie pressed her hand against the cold glass, watching until the posse disappeared into the night. The same darkness that had swallowed Logan hours earlier now seemed hungry for more. She thought of the cabin in the high timber, with its carefully tended hearth and shelves of medicine. The children's books Logan kept for young visitors. Martha's worried face in the doorway. All the secret kindnesses recorded in that worn ledger. And now armed men were riding toward it all, carried by a hatred as old as her own had been, a hatred that suddenly felt hollow in her chest, eaten away by doubt and dawning questions. The lamp flickered as a cold wind rattled the window. Somewhere up in the darkness, a man who had saved her life was about to face judgment for a crime she was no longer certain he'd committed. But the posse was already gone, carrying 12 years of vengeance into the mountain night. The gray hours before dawn found Hallie already awake, dressed and watching through her window. She had barely slept, haunted by the sound of horses departing into the night. Now she strained to hear their return. The first hint came with distant hoofbeats, growing steadily louder in the pre-dawn stillness. Hallie pressed closer to the cold glass, her breath fogging the pain. Through the mist, she made out a group of riders emerging from the darkness. Sheriff Hale led them, his posture stiff with purpose. Behind him rode 2 deputies, and between them, Hallie's hand flew to her throat. Logan sat straight-backed on his horse, hands bound before him. Even from this distance, she could see he had offered no resistance. His head was unbowed, his bearing dignified despite the circumstances. The sight struck something deep in her chest, an emotion she couldn't name. More townspeople appeared on the street as the group passed, drawn by the commotion. Some still wore nightclothes beneath hastily donned coats. Whispers rose like smoke in the cold air. "They got him. Finally bringing him to justice. 12 years too late, if you ask me." Hallie watched as they led Logan to the jail, a solid brick building that seemed to swallow him into its shadows. The crowd lingered, growing larger as word spread through the awakening town. She turned away from the window, her hands trembling as she smoothed her skirts. The sun had barely cleared the mountains when the church bells began to ring. Not the usual measured toll for Sunday service, but an urgent, irregular peal that sent birds scattering from the rooftops. Hallie knew, with a certainty that chilled her, that this summoning had nothing to do with worship. She made her way down to the street, joining the stream of people heading toward the jail. The crowd had swelled to include nearly every able-bodied adult in Pine Ridge. Their faces wore a peculiar mix of righteousness and anticipation that made her stomach turn. Silas Crowell stood on the jail's front steps, conferring with Sheriff Hale. His voice carried across the gathering crowd. "The people want justice seen done, Sheriff. Proper and legal, of course, but seen done all the same." Hallie pushed through the press of bodies, ignoring the whispers that followed her. At the jail's entrance, Deputy Wilson blocked her path. "Miss Hollis, maybe best you don't. I need to see him." Her voice came out steadier than she felt. "Please." The deputy hesitated, then nodded toward Sheriff Hale, who studied her for a long moment before sighing. "5 minutes, Miss Hollis. That's all I can give you." The jail's interior was cool and dim after the bright morning light. Hallie followed the deputy down a short corridor to the cells. Logan sat on a narrow bunk in the last one, his hands folded in his lap. He looked up as they approached, his expression unreadable. "Lady to see you, Rourke," the deputy announced, then retreated to give them some privacy while remaining within sight. Hallie gripped the iron bars, willing her voice not to shake. "Why did you do it?" Logan met her gaze steadily. "Do what, Miss Hollis?" "The fire." The words tasted bitter in her mouth. "My parents' home, all of it. I need to hear you say it." He was silent for so long she thought he wouldn't answer. When he finally spoke, his voice was low and rough with emotion. "The truth isn't always what we think it is." "What does that mean?" Anger flared in her chest. "Either you set that fire or you didn't." "It's not that simple." His hands tightened in his lap. "Some burdens need bearing. Some costs need paying." "Stop speaking in riddles." Hallie's frustration broke through her control. "You saved my life. You've been helping people in secret for years. I saw the ledger. Why would you do that if—" She caught herself, lowered her voice. "Just tell me the truth." Logan stood and approached the bars, close enough that she could see the weight of years in his eyes. "The truth is, I lit that fire. But the rest—" He shook his head. "Let it be, Miss Hollis. Please. Some things are better carried alone." "But—" "My time's about up," he said softly, glancing at the deputy. "Go on now. Find peace with what you know." "I don't know anything," Hallie whispered, but Logan had already turned away, returning to his bunk with the air of a man who had said all he meant to say. The deputy escorted her out. She emerged into late morning sunlight, blinking against its harsh glare. The crowd had grown even larger, their murmuring taking on an ugly edge. She pushed through them blindly, needing to be anywhere else. Her feet carried her to the church, its white-painted walls offering the promise of sanctuary. Inside, the air was cool and still, smelling of beeswax and old hymnals. She sank onto a back pew, trying to order her thoughts. "Miss Hollis?" She started at the voice. Reverend Bell stood in the shadow of the pulpit, his kind face drawn with concern. He moved to sit beside her, his movements careful as if approaching a spooked animal. "I saw them bring him in," the Reverend said quietly. "I've been praying about what to do." Something in his tone made Hallie turn to study him. "What do you mean?" The older man's hands worked at his collar as if it had grown too tight. There are matters I should have spoken of long ago. But fear, he shook his head. Fear makes cowards of us all, doesn't it? Reverend? Hallie leaned forward. What things? He wouldn't meet her eyes. That fire. I had suspicions at the time. Things I noticed. Conversations I overheard. Nothing I could prove, mind you, but enough to make me wonder if it wasn't quite the accident everyone claimed. Hallie's heart began to pound. What kind of conversations? Threats, mainly. About land rights, water access. The Reverend's voice dropped lower. Some men in this town had plans for those mountains. Plans that certain homesteaders were complicating. Are you saying... Hallie could barely force the words out. Are you saying the fire was ordered? I'm saying I wondered. Still wonder. He finally looked at her directly. But I had no proof. Just the word of a young logger who came to me after, half mad with guilt, talking about threats to his family if he didn't cooperate. About having no choice. The Reverend's shoulders slumped. I should have done something. Spoken up. But these are powerful men, Miss Hollis. I told myself my first duty was to protect my congregation. Logan, Hallie whispered. It was Logan who came to you? Reverend Bell nodded slowly. He was different then. Younger. Desperate. He confessed to lighting the fire, but the rest... He spread his hands helplessly. I gave him absolution, but I think he's been trying to earn it ever since. Hallie sat back, her mind whirling. The ledger, the medicine, the quiet acts of restitution. A young man forced to choose between his starving siblings and a terrible act. The weight of guilt that drove him to live alone in the high country, trying to balance an impossible debt. Why tell me this now? She asked. Because they mean to hold a trial tomorrow. The Reverend's voice shook slightly. A proper one, they say, but we both know what they really want. And I can't stay silent anymore, watching another wrong pile onto all the others. He reached for her hand, his grip urgent. Go to the schoolhouse, child. In my desk there's a folder of papers, documents I should have shown the sheriff 12 years ago. Proof of certain men's interests in that land. Maybe it's not enough, but it's something. He released her, standing quickly. I need to prepare myself. There are confessions that need making, and not just in private. Hallie barely remembered leaving the church. The afternoon sun was starting its westward slide when she found herself standing in the mountain schoolhouse. The building was silent and cold, dust motes dancing in the slanting light through its windows. She found the folder easily enough, tucked in the bottom drawer of the Reverend's desk where he sometimes worked between his circuit riding duties. Inside were property deeds, water rights documents, letters between wealthy men discussing plans for the timber and the land. And threaded through it all, a pattern of pressure and intimidation against those who stood in the way. Hallie spread the papers across the desk, her parents' Bible open beside them. The past she had clung to for 12 years was unraveling, revealing a darker, more complicated truth beneath. The pieces were there. Logan's quiet penance, Crowell's manipulations, the Reverend's fear, her own growing doubts. She stood at the schoolhouse window, watching shadows lengthen across the yard. Somewhere in the town below, a man sat in a jail cell, willing to bear punishment for a crime that was both more and less than what it seemed. And tomorrow, unless something changed, a town's hunger for vengeance would pass for justice. The schoolhouse creaked softly in the cooling air. Hallie gathered the papers carefully, tucking them into her father's Bible. The truth was indeed not what she had thought it was. The question now was what she would do with it. The morning after her discovery in the schoolhouse, Hallie stood before her students with chalk dust on her fingers and determination in her heart. Though her mind wandered to the papers hidden in her room, she forced herself to focus on the lesson at hand. "Now, who can tell me the capital of Montana Territory?" she asked, tapping the crude map she'd drawn on the blackboard. As little Sarah Miller's hand shot up eagerly, Hallie caught movement outside the schoolhouse window. Martha Rourke was making her way slowly up the path, wrapped in a threadbare shawl against the morning chill. The sight reminded Hallie of her promise to visit. When the children had been dismissed for the day, Hallie gathered her things quickly. The walk to the Rourke cabin took nearly an hour, but the early spring air was crisp and sweet with melting snow. Martha welcomed her with a wan smile, gesturing to a chair by the hearth. "I'm right grateful you've come," Martha said, settling into her own seat with careful movements. Even that small effort left her breathing hard. "It gets mighty lonely up here some days." Hallie accepted the offered cup of tea, noting how Martha's hands trembled slightly. "You're not well." "Oh, just the lingering effects of hard times." Martha's smile was gentle but tired. "We didn't fare so well after everything happened." "Will you tell me?" Hallie asked softly. Martha's gaze grew distant. "Logan was just 19 when Pa died, leaving him to care for me and our younger brothers. He got work with the logging camps, but it wasn't enough. That winter was bitter cold, and food was scarce." She paused, fingers tracing the rim of her cup. "Then Mr. Crowell came with his offer." "What kind of offer?" "The kind that ain't really an offer at all." Martha's voice hardened slightly. "He owned most of the camps by then. Said he'd make sure none of us worked again if Logan didn't help clear some land that was causing trouble for the railroad. Said we'd starve come winter." She met Hallie's eyes. "We nearly did anyway after. No camp would hire Logan once word spread about the fire. The little ones got sick. I never quite got my strength back." Hallie's throat tightened. "The younger brothers?" "Gone now." Martha looked away. "Tommy took fever that first winter. Johnny headed west soon as he was old enough. Couldn't bear staying. Logan's carried the weight of it all ever since." They sat in silence for a while, the fire crackling softly. Finally, Martha reached over and took Hallie's hand. "I know what you lost," she said quietly. "And I'm more sorry than words can say. But Logan, he's punished himself worse than any court could. Everything he does, every person he helps, it's trying to make right what went wrong that night." Hallie squeezed Martha's fingers gently before standing. "Thank you for telling me this." The next morning found Hallie at the county clerk's office as soon as it opened. The elderly clerk knew her family name and gave her sympathetic looks as she requested the land records from 12 years ago. Hours passed as Hallie pored over dusty ledgers and faded documents. Her back ached from bending over the desk, but determination drove her forward. Finally, in a file of railroad proposals, she found what she was looking for. Her parents' homestead, along with several others, had been marked for clearing. Weeks before the fire, Silas Crowell's signature appeared repeatedly on documents discussing the obstacle of settler claims to land needed for timber access. The pattern was clear to anyone who knew to look for it. Hallie copied key details with shaking hands, adding them to the papers from Reverend Bell's desk. The truth was assembling itself piece by piece, and it was ugly. That evening, she returned to the jail. Logan sat in the same position as before, but his eyes showed recognition when she approached the bars. "I've been learning things," Hallie said without preamble. "About Crowell, about what really happened." Logan's shoulders tensed. "Miss Hollis." "No," she cut him off firmly. "No more deflecting, no more half-truths. I need to hear all of it, Logan, please." He studied her face for a long moment, then nodded slowly. Sit down then. It's not a short tale. Hallie drew up the wooden chair, settling in as Logan began to speak. His voice was low and rough with emotion. Crowell came to me that summer, said he had a job needed doing. Simple work, he called it. Just starting a controlled burn to clear some troublesome land. Logan's hands clenched in his lap. When I hesitated, he reminded me how many mouths I had to feed, how easy it would be for accidents to happen in the logging camps where my brothers worked. He knew exactly how to pressure you, Hallie said softly. Logan nodded. I agreed, God help me, but when I learned which homesteads were marked, he drew a shuddering breath. I tried to warn people. Rode out the night before, but the weather turned foul. By the time I reached the first farm, Crowell's men had already started fires in 3 places. You couldn't stop it, Hallie whispered. I tried. His voice cracked. Rode until my horse nearly dropped, trying to reach everyone. But the wind came up wrong, and the fire moved too fast. When I got to your parents' place, he stopped, pain etching deep lines around his eyes. Tell me, Hallie urged, though her heart was pounding. Your father was trying to save the livestock. Your mother was gathering papers from the house. I shouted for them to run, but the smoke was too thick. The barn went up like tinder. Logan's words came faster now, as if he couldn't hold them back any longer. I got your father out, but he was badly burned. He begged me to find your mother. I found her unconscious inside, but when I tried to carry her out, the roof started coming down. Your father ran back in after us. Tears were streaming down Hallie's face now. You couldn't save them? Logan shook his head, his own eyes wet. The doctor said the smoke got them before the fire did. Small mercy, that. But I should have done more. Should have refused Crowell from the start. Should have found another way. You were trying to protect your family, Hallie said, just like my father tried to protect my mother. Just like she tried to protect our home. Doesn't make it right. Logan's voice was barely audible. Nothing makes it right. No, Hallie agreed. But it wasn't all your doing either. Crowell orchestrated everything. He used you, used everyone. They sat in silence for a long moment, the weight of truth settling between them. Finally, Hallie spoke again, her voice thick with tears. I've hated you for so long, she admitted. Blamed you for everything I lost. But now... She drew a shaking breath. Now I see you lost everything too. Logan met her gaze, his eyes full of a pain that matched her own. I don't ask for forgiveness, Miss Hollis. Don't deserve it. But I am sorry. More sorry than I have words to say. Something broke inside Hallie then, not in rage or bitterness, but in a rush of grief too long denied. She wept openly, for her parents, for the Rourke children, for all the lives Crowell's greed had destroyed. And through her tears, she heard Logan's voice, rough with emotion, beginning to pray. Lord, we come before you broken, he murmured, carrying burdens too heavy for human hearts. Grant us wisdom to see your truth, courage to speak it, strength to bear it. Hallie found herself joining in, her own voice trembling. And faith to trust your mercy, even when justice seems far away. Amen, they finished together. The jail grew quiet, except for the soft sounds of their shared grief slowly easing. Outside, the sun was setting, painting the cell walls with bars of golden light. It wasn't peace exactly. There were still too many wounds for that. But something had shifted. Truth had been spoken at last, and with it came the first faint stirring of hope. As Hallie finally rose to leave, she paused at the cell door. What happens now? Logan's expression was solemn but steady. Truth needs telling, no matter the cost. Reckon it's time I stopped carrying this alone. Hallie nodded, understanding. The path ahead would not be easy, but at least now they could see it clearly. Sometimes healing had to begin with letting the wound breathe. Dawn broke cold and clear over Pine Ridge as Hallie hurried through her morning duties at the schoolhouse. Her mind raced with possibilities while she wrote arithmetic problems on the blackboard. There had to be more evidence of Crowell's schemes somewhere in town. The truth was there. She just had to find it. During the lunch hour, while the children played in the yard, Hallie visited Reverend Bell at the parsonage. She found him in his study, surrounded by old church records. "I've been praying about this," the Reverend said, his weathered face grave. "What I witnessed back then, the irregular meetings, the threats against those who questioned the fire's cause, it needs telling." He pulled out a leather-bound notebook. "I kept notes, thinking someday I might find the courage to speak." Hallie leaned forward eagerly. "Will you testify, Reverend?" He nodded slowly. "Yes, it's past time I did what's right instead of what's safe. The Lord forgive me for waiting so long." Relief flooded through Hallie. "Thank you," she whispered. "Your word carries weight in this town." "Not as much as Crowell's money," the Reverend warned. "Be careful, Miss Hollis. That man has buried inconvenient truths before." Leaving the parsonage, Hallie noticed a familiar face across the street. Sam Tucker, who'd worked the logging camps during the fire. He caught her eye, then deliberately turned down the alley behind the general store. Hallie followed, finding the old logger nervously checking over his shoulder. "Miss Hollis," he said in a low voice, "I saw you coming from the Reverend's. You're gathering evidence about the fire, ain't you?" "I am," she confirmed. "Did you see something that night?" Sam glanced around again before speaking. "I was on Crowell's crew back then. Night before the fire, I heard him giving orders to some men, telling them exactly where to start the burns, how to make it look accidental." His hands shook slightly. "Been carrying that knowledge a long time." Hope surged in Hallie's chest. "Will you testify to that?" Fear flickered across Sam's weathered face. "I got family to think about, miss. Crowell, he's got ways of making life mighty difficult for folks who cross him. Lost my logging job just for asking questions back then." "I understand," Hallie said softly, though disappointment weighted her words. "Thank you for telling me, at least." She spent the afternoon teaching, her mind churning with possibilities. The mill office held years of timber records. Surely there would be proof of Crowell's land-grabbing scheme in those pages. As darkness fell, Hallie was walking past the mill when she noticed flickering light in the storage shed out back. Smoke curled from beneath the door. "Fire!" she shouted, running toward the building. "Fire in the records shed!" But she was too late. Through the window she could see flames consuming stacks of ledgers and documents. 2 men slipped away into the shadows as she approached. The volunteer fire brigade arrived quickly, but by the time they extinguished the blaze, most of the records were ash. Hallie stood in the smoking ruins, heart sinking as she sifted through charred paper fragments. "Mighty, unfortunate accident," came Crowell's smooth voice behind her. She turned to find him watching with calculated concern. "All those old records lost. Still, they were just taking up space, weren't they?" The threat in his tone was clear. Hallie met his gaze steadily. "There are some things fire can't erase, Mr. Crowell." His eyes hardened. "Be careful, Miss Hollis. Teaching positions can be precarious, especially for young women who meddle in the past." Snow began falling as Hallie walked back to her room, the first heavy flakes of another storm. By morning, the roads would be difficult to travel. Any hope of bringing in outside investigators or witnesses would have to wait. She had barely finished breakfast the next day when she heard the news. Logan had been formally charged with arson and multiple counts of manslaughter. The trial was set for the following week. "Community safety demands swift justice," Judge Harrison declared from the courthouse steps. "We can't have dangerous men walking free while we wait for spring thaws." Hallie knew the real reason for the rush. Crowell wanted this settled before anyone could dig too deeply into the truth. She was still processing this when a messenger arrived at the schoolhouse with a note from the school board. The message was politely worded but clear. Her position as teacher would be reconsidered if she continued involving herself in matters best left to the proper authorities. That evening, after her students had gone home, Hallie sat alone in the empty church. Lamplight gleamed softly on the wooden pews as she bowed her head in prayer. "Lord," she whispered, "I know what standing up will cost. My job, my place here may be worse." She drew a deep breath. "But I can't stay silent. Not when an innocent man's life hangs in the balance. Not when truth itself is at stake." The church was quiet except for the soft fall of snow outside. Hallie remained kneeling, drawing strength from the stillness. Finally she stood, resolution settling over her like a mantle. Let them take her job. Let them drive her from town. Some things mattered more than safety or security. Truth was one of them. Justice was another. Tomorrow she would begin gathering what evidence remained. There would be no turning back now. Outside, the snow continued falling steadily, blanketing Pine Ridge in white. But even the deepest snow eventually melted. And when it did, truth had a way of coming to light, if someone was brave enough to stand for it. The Pine Ridge courthouse stood stark against the winter sky as townsfolk filed in for the trial. Hallie settled onto a hard wooden bench near the front, her heart heavy as she watched Logan being led in, hands bound. He kept his eyes downcast, shoulders squared beneath his clean but worn shirt. Judge Harrison called the court to order with 3 sharp raps of his gavel. The sound echoed through the packed room like gunshots. "We are here to try the matter of Logan Rourke," he intoned, "accused of arson and the deaths of 7 citizens, including James and Mary Hollis." Hallie noticed how Silas Crowell lounged in his seat near the prosecution, expensive suit immaculate, watching the proceedings with the satisfied air of a man who already knew the ending. The prosecution called their first witness, elderly Tom Mackenzie, who had been deputy sheriff during the fire. His testimony hadn't changed in 12 years. "Saw him riding away from the burn site," Mackenzie declared, jabbing a finger toward Logan. "Horse was lathered, like he'd been pushing hard to get clear. Smoke was already rising by then." Logan sat motionless, accepting each accusation without protest. Only the tight line of his jaw betrayed any emotion. More witnesses followed, each repeating the same rehearsed story. Logan had been seen near the fire. Logan had threatened landowners. Logan had disappeared right after. Hallie recognized the carefully crafted narrative Crowell had built over the years. When Martha Rourke was called to testify, she spoke softly but firmly about their desperate circumstances before the fire. "We were starving," she said, her voice carrying clearly through the hushed courtroom. "The logging camps wouldn't hire our PA after he spoke against unsafe conditions. Logan tried everything to keep food on our table." "So your brother had reason to be angry at the logging companies?" the prosecutor pressed. "No, sir, that's not what I—" No further questions. By afternoon, when Hallie finally took the stand, the weight of predetermined guilt lay heavy in the air. She spoke clearly about the evidence she'd gathered. The land records showing her parents' property had been marked for clearing, the pattern of mysterious fires that always seemed to benefit Crowell's expansion plans. "Objection," Crowell's lawyer drawled. "Miss Hollis is attempting to introduce unsubstantiated speculation about matters not directly related to the crime at hand." "Sustained," Judge Harrison ruled. "Please confine your testimony to direct knowledge of the event in question, Miss Hollis." "But, Your Honor, these records show a clear pattern of—" "Miss Hollis." The judge's tone carried warning. You will respect the court's ruling or be held in contempt." Hallie gripped the railing of the witness stand, frustrated tears pressing behind her eyes. She caught Logan's gaze. He gave an almost imperceptible shake of his head, silently asking her not to risk herself further. After several more witnesses, the judge announced, "This court will adjourn until tomorrow morning." His gavel fell with grim finality. As the courthouse emptied, Hallie noticed Reverend Bell looking troubled. He had been scheduled to testify but was never called. The prosecutor had strategically avoided any witness who might question the official narrative. That evening, Hallie visited Logan in his cell. Moonlight filtered through the barred window, casting shadows across his weary face. "You should go home, Miss Hollis," he said softly. "There's nothing more to be done here." "There's always something more to be done," Hallie insisted. "The truth." "The truth?" Logan's laugh held no humor. "Truth died in that fire 12 years ago, along with your parents." He moved closer to the bars, his voice dropping. "I've made my peace with what's coming. Maybe." He hesitated. "Maybe this is what's needed to free you from the past, to let you find peace." "Peace built on lies isn't peace at all," Hallie said fiercely. "I won't abandon you to this injustice." "You've shown more mercy than I deserve already." Logan's eyes held deep sadness. "I may not have set that fire, but I failed to prevent it. Your parents' blood is still on my hands." "The only blood on your hands is what Crowell put there," Hallie whispered, "and I aim to prove it." She left the jail with determination burning in her heart, though she had no idea how to turn the tide of tomorrow's proceedings. The prosecution had systematically dismantled their defense, blocking key testimony and burning crucial records. That night, Hallie slept fitfully, her dreams haunted by flames and falling timber. She woke before dawn to find the sky had cleared dramatically overnight. The storm clouds that had lingered for days were gone, leaving the morning air crystal clear and cold. She dressed quickly and headed to the courthouse early, hoping to speak with Logan's lawyer before proceedings began. As she rounded the corner onto Main Street, she stopped short. A line of wagons was pulling into town, at least 6 of them, loaded with people. She recognized old Sam Tucker sitting beside one driver. In another wagon, she spotted faces she knew from neighboring settlements. More vehicles appeared on the horizon, raising dust along the mountain road. Word had somehow spread beyond Pine Ridge, and witnesses were arriving from all directions. Providence had opened an unexpected door. Reverend Bell hurried up beside her, hope lighting his aged face. "News travels in mysterious ways," he said quietly, "especially when the Lord has a hand in its journey." Hallie watched as more wagons rolled in, her heart lifting with each arrival. These were people who had seen the truth 12 years ago, but been too afraid to speak. Now, finally, they had found their courage. The morning sun rose bright and clear over Pine Ridge, its light touching the courthouse steps where justice had so long been denied. Today, that would change. Today, truth would finally have its say. The courthouse buzzed with nervous energy as dawn's first light spilled through tall windows. Extra benches had been brought in to accommodate the unexpected crowd, yet still people stood along the walls, their faces grim with purpose. Martha Rourke entered slowly, leaning on her brother's lawyer for support. Her face was pale but determined as she made her way to the witness stand. Logan half rose from his seat, concern etching his features as he watched his sister's labored progress. "Please state your name for the court," Judge Harrison instructed, his tone gentler than the previous day. "Martha Elizabeth Rourke," she replied, her voice soft but clear. Though her body was frail, her spine remained straight as steel. "Miss Rourke, please tell the court about the winter before the fire," the defense lawyer prompted. Martha's hands twisted in her lap. "We were desperate that winter. Pa had been blacklisted from the logging camps for speaking up about unsafe conditions. Ma was sick. Logan tried everything to keep food on our table. Hunting, trapping, odd jobs. But it wasn't enough. And what happened when Silas Crowell approached your brother? Crowell's lawyer shot to his feet. Objection. Hearsay, Your Honor. I was there, Martha said firmly. I heard every word myself. The judge nodded. Overruled. Continue, Miss Rourke. Mr. Crowell came to our cabin 2 weeks before the fire. He told Logan there would be a controlled burn to clear land for the railroad. Said if Logan helped, we'd get enough money to last the winter. Martha's voice shook. Logan refused, said it wasn't safe with the drought. But then Mr. Crowell... She paused, gathering strength. Take your time, Miss Rourke, the judge encouraged. He said if Logan didn't help, he'd make sure no one in Pine Ridge would ever hire Pa again. Said he'd see us starve. Tears slid down Martha's cheeks. Logan still said no, but then I took sick too, and the doctor wouldn't come because we couldn't pay. The courtroom was absolutely silent now, every eye fixed on the young woman's face. The morning of the fire, Mr. Crowell's men came back. They had torches already lit. They told Logan either he could help them set the controlled edges, or they'd burn it all at once. Martha looked directly at Crowell. They'd arranged it so Logan would be seen near the fire no matter what he chose. Crowell maintained his composed expression, but his fingers drummed restlessly on the table before him. What did your brother do then? The lawyer asked. He tried to warn people, rode as fast as he could to spread word about the fire coming, but the wind shifted. Martha's voice broke. It wasn't supposed to reach the homesteads. Logan tried to stop it, but... Thank you, Miss Rourke, the lawyer said gently. No further questions. The prosecutor declined to cross-examine, perhaps sensing the damage already done to their case. As Martha was helped from the stand, Reverend Amos Bell stepped forward to be sworn in. The elderly preacher gripped the Bible with weathered hands. I've carried this burden far too long, he began without prompting. 12 years ago, I noticed irregularities in land claims filed with the county. Properties marked for railroad expansion were experiencing unusual accidents. Fires, flood damage, mysterious property line disputes. Objection, Crowell's lawyer called out. Relevance? I'll allow it, Judge. Harrison ruled, leaning forward with interest. I brought my concerns to Mr. Crowell, as he was a prominent member of the church building committee. Reverend Bell's shoulders sagged. He explained it away, made it sound reasonable. But then I saw the survey maps. At the prosecution table, Crowell's face tightened almost imperceptibly. What maps, Reverend? The defense lawyer asked. The original survey maps from before the fire. They showed the planned railroad route cutting straight through established homesteads, including the Hollis property. The preacher's voice strengthened. A week after I saw those maps, my church received an anonymous donation of $5,000. I convinced myself it was providence, not a bribe for silence. Murmurs rippled through the courtroom. Judge Harrison rapped his gavel once. I've asked God's forgiveness for my cowardice, Reverend Bell continued. Now I ask this court's forgiveness, and the forgiveness of those who suffered while I remained silent. The defense called their next witness, Samuel Whitaker, former county land surveyor. The elderly man settled into the witness stand, unfolding several creased papers. These are copies of the original survey maps from 1872, he explained, handling them carefully. I kept them when I noticed discrepancies between these and the official filings after the fire. The maps were entered into evidence and displayed for the court. Whitaker pointed out key details with a gnarled finger. See here, the original route respected existing property lines. But these later filings? He produced another set of documents. Property boundaries were altered, dates were changed, Someone had gone to considerable trouble to make it appear these homesteads were in violation of railroad right-of-way. The prosecutor slumped in his chair, shooting worried glances at Crowell, who sat unnaturally still, his usual smooth confidence cracking at the edges. A stir near the back of the courtroom drew attention as James McKinnon, a former logger, made his way forward. He walked with a pronounced limp, a souvenir many knew from a logging accident years ago. "I worked Crowell's camps for 15 years, McKinnon testified after being sworn in. His voice trembled slightly, but he pressed on. "Was there the day he ordered the fire set, said anyone who breathed a word would never work timber again." He looked at Logan. Rourke tried to stop it. When the wind turned, he rode straight into the flames, trying to reach the homesteads. Nearly died himself. Crowell's composure finally shattered. He shoved back from the prosecution table, face mottled with rage. "These are lies, malicious slander from disgruntled workers and religious fanatics." "Mr. Crowell!" Judge Harrison's gavel crashed down. "You will maintain order in this court or be removed." But Crowell was beyond hearing. "I built this town. Everything I did was for progress, for civilization. A few worthless homesteads were nothing compared to—" He caught himself, but too late. The judge's face hardened. "Mr. Crowell, approach the bench." As Crowell stepped forward, the judge gestured to the sheriff. "Take him into custody and send deputies to arrest his foreman." He turned to the jury. "In light of the evidence presented and Mr. Crowell's own admission, this case against Logan Rourke is dismissed." The courtroom erupted in confused noise. Logan sat motionless, tears streaming silently down his face as Martha embraced him. Hallie watched from her seat, her own eyes wet with a complex mixture of grief and relief. Crowell fought against the sheriff's grip as iron manacles were locked around his wrists. "You can't do this! I own half this county!" "Not anymore," Judge Harrison said coldly. "Bailiff, remove the prisoner." The afternoon light slanted low through the courthouse windows as Crowell was led away in chains. The entire town seemed to hold its breath, watching the man who had wielded so much power now humbled before the law. Logan stood slowly, officially a free man, yet his shoulders remained bowed under the weight of memory and moral burden. He had been cleared of murder, but the deaths of those he couldn't save would haunt him always. The townspeople filed out in stunned silence, struggling to process how thoroughly their understanding of the past had been upended. 12 years of certainty had been stripped away, leaving them to grapple with their own roles in a terrible injustice. As Crowell was escorted toward the jail, his fine suit now coated with dust, he passed Logan on the courthouse steps. For a moment, the two men's eyes met, one finally facing punishment for his crimes, the other freed from false blame, but still chained by guilt. Then Crowell was led away, and the frozen moment broke. The winter sun cast long shadows across Pine Ridge's main street as justice, delayed but not defeated, finally found its way home. The truth had come to light at last, though its revelation left both healing and hurt in its wake. For some, like Crowell, it meant a reckoning long overdue. For others, like Logan, it offered freedom tainted by the bitter knowledge that it came 12 years too late to save those who mattered most. The townsfolk dispersed slowly, their previous certainties shaken, forced to confront their own complicity in years of accepted lies. They left the courthouse square in ones and twos, heading home to wrestle with questions of conscience and community, while overhead, the winter sky stretched clear and cold above Pine Ridge's altered landscape of truth. The courthouse doors creaked open as people filed out into the crisp winter air. Tension hung as thick as wood smoke over Pine Ridge's main street. Townsfolk gathered in clusters, their breath forming clouds in the cold afternoon light as they whispered and watched. Logan stood alone on the courthouse steps, his tall frame casting a long shadow. Though cleared of murder, 12 years of isolation had carved deep lines into his weathered face. He kept his eyes downcast, expecting no welcome from a town that had long cast him as villain. Hallie emerged last, clutching her father's worn Bible. The crowd parted before her, waiting. Everyone knew her role in exposing Crowell's crimes, but they expected her to walk away now that justice was done. After all, Logan had still set the fire, even if under duress. Some wounds, they reckoned, ran too deep for healing. Martha Rourke stood nearby, tears streaming down her hollow cheeks. She reached for her brother's arm, ready to lead him back to their mountain solitude, but Hallie's clear voice rang out, stopping them. "Mr. Rourke." Logan turned slowly, his shoulders tense. Hallie walked toward him with measured steps, her skirts brushing the wooden planks. The watching crowd drew closer, straining to hear. "You asked me once to let you bear the punishment," Hallie said, her voice carrying in the hushed street. "But that burden was never yours alone to carry." She opened her father's Bible, touching the familiar pages. "I've read these words 1,000 times, seeking comfort. But I missed their deepest truth until now." Her fingers traced the well-worn verses. "Forgiveness isn't just for those who deserve it. It's for those who need it most." Gasps rippled through the crowd. Several women dabbed at their eyes with handkerchiefs. Even the men shifted uncomfortably, unable to look away from this unexpected scene unfolding before them. "The fire took my parents," Hallie continued, her voice breaking slightly. "Nothing can change that. But I understand now that you tried to save them, even at the cost of your own life." She took a deep breath. "I forgive you, Logan Rourke. Not because what happened wasn't terrible, but because I see how deeply you've repented, how you've spent these years trying to make amends in secret." Logan's hands trembled. "Miss Hollis, I don't deserve—" "No," she interrupted gently. "None of us deserve forgiveness. That's what makes it grace." Martha sobbed openly now, clutching her brother's arm. Other women in the crowd were crying too, perhaps remembering their own unhealed hurts, their own needs for mercy. Reverend Bell stepped forward, his aged voice carrying across the courthouse square. "Amen, Miss Hollis. You speak God's truth." He turned to address the gathered townspeople. "We've all carried this burden too long. Perhaps it's time we learned from this young woman's example?" Logan stood straighter, as if a great weight was lifting from his shoulders. He looked at Hallie with wonder, seeing not just the girl who'd lost everything, but the woman who'd found the strength to offer grace. "Miss Hollis," he said softly, though in the silence his words carried clearly, "I've lived these years in penance, never expecting absolution. Your forgiveness is more than I dared hope for." He paused, gathering courage. "But if you're willing, I'd ask for something more." The crowd held its breath as Logan slowly knelt on the courthouse steps, not in shame now, but in humility and hope. "I know I have no right to ask," he continued, his voice rough with emotion. "But these past days have shown me your strength, your wisdom, and your faith. Would you consider joining your life to mine, not out of guilt or obligation, but as partners in whatever path God sets before us?" A collective gasp rose from the onlookers. Hallie's eyes widened, her hand rising to her throat. For a long moment, only the winter wind spoke, whistling between the buildings. Then, soft as falling snow, Hallie smiled. "Yes," she whispered, then louder, "Yes, I will." As if heaven itself marked the moment, tiny snowflakes began drifting down from the pearl-gray sky. They settled like stars in Hallie's dark hair as Logan rose and took her hands in his. Martha rushed forward to embrace them both, her joy infectious. Reverend Bell stepped up, laying weathered hands on their shoulders in blessing. "The Lord works in mysterious ways," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "Sometimes the path to healing runs straight through our deepest wounds." The watching crowd stirred, uncertain how to respond to this transformation. Then old Mrs. Peterson, who had lost her own daughter in the fire, walked forward. She reached up to touch Logan's cheek with gnarled fingers. "Welcome home, boy," she said softly. "We've all carried grief too long." It was as if a dam broke. Other townspeople moved forward, offering cautious congratulations. Some, like James McKinnon, clasped Logan's hand firmly. Others simply nodded, not ready for more but acknowledging the change. The snow fell more steadily now, dusting the courthouse steps with white. It covered the muddy street and settled on roof edges, as if nature herself wanted to offer a clean page. "I reckon we ought to get inside before this storm sets in," Sheriff Matthews said gruffly, but with a hint of smile beneath his mustache. "Reverend, might your wife have some coffee hot?" "And fresh bread too, if I know Sarah," Reverend Bell agreed. "Miss Hollis, Mrs. Rourke-to-be, would you and your intended care to join us?" Hallie looked up at Logan, seeing peace finally settling into the shadows of his eyes. "Yes," she said. "I believe we would." As they walked toward the parsonage, the snow continued its gentle descent. It covered the courthouse where justice had finally prevailed, the jail where Crowell contemplated his crimes, and the street where forgiveness had transformed condemnation into hope. Children ventured out to catch snowflakes on their tongues, their laughter brightening the winter afternoon. Women called from porches, inviting neighbors in for hot cider and conversation. Men nodded to each other as they hurried to finish the day's work, their usual gruff manner softened by the day's events. Inside the warm parsonage, Sarah Bell fussed over Hallie and Logan, while Martha rested in a comfortable chair. The Reverend's study filled with townspeople sharing coffee and conversation, their voices a gentle murmur of community rebuilding itself. Through the window they could see the snow transforming Pine Ridge. It softened hard edges and smoothed rough places, much as forgiveness had begun to heal the town's old wounds. The past couldn't be changed, but the future stretched before them like fresh snow, waiting for new footprints, new stories, new grace. Hallie sat beside Logan, their fingers intertwined, watching hope fall from heaven in delicate flakes. Tomorrow would bring its own challenges, a wedding to plan, a life to build, a community to restore. But for now, they simply sat together in the warmth of forgiveness, surrounded by the gentle sound of falling snow and the murmur of people learning to be neighbors again. The mountain winter began to loosen its iron grip as February gave way to March. Patches of muddy earth appeared between shrinking snowdrifts, and the morning air carried hints of coming spring. Pine Ridge stirred from its frozen slumber, shaking off old grievances like melting icicles. Hallie continued her daily rides to the mountain schoolhouse, though now the journey felt different. Hope rode with her, warming her heart even on the coldest mornings. Her students noticed the change in their teacher, how her smile came more readily, and her lessons often included stories about forgiveness and new beginnings. One crisp morning, as Hallie approached the schoolhouse, she heard the steady rhythm of hammering. Logan stood on a ladder, replacing worn shingles on the roof. He paused his work when she arrived, touching the brim of his hat in greeting. "Thought the roof could use some attention before spring rains come," he said simply. Hallie nodded, noting how he'd already repaired the sagging porch steps and replaced a broken window. "Much obliged, Mr. Rourke. The children will be glad to stay dry." Their courtship unfolded slowly, respectfully, under the watchful but approving eyes of the town. Logan found reasons to be in Pine Ridge more often, taking odd jobs that needed strong hands and careful attention. He mended Bradley Cooper's fence line, helped William Foster raise a new barn, and cleared winter deadfall from the cemetery road. Each small task rebuilt trust, proving through quiet action that he meant to be part of the community again. The men who worked beside him discovered his steady nature, his willingness to share his strength without seeking praise. Women who had once hurried past now stopped to greet him, especially after he rescued Mrs. Peterson's cat from a tall pine tree. Martha flourished, too, regaining color in her cheeks as spring approached. Sarah Bell took her under wing, teaching her to bake and tend the parsonage garden. Young Thomas McKinnon began finding excuses to visit whenever Martha helped at the mercantile, his shy smiles meeting her gentle ones. Reverend Bell guided Hallie and Logan's courtship with grandfatherly wisdom. Each Sunday after services, they would sit in his study, discussing scripture and their shared future. The old preacher helped them navigate the delicate balance of private healing and public reconciliation. "Love that grows from forgiveness," he told them one afternoon, "has deep roots. It won't wither in the first frost." Their daily lives fell into comfortable rhythms. Logan would often meet Hallie after school, walking her horse beside his as they descended the mountain together. They talked of small things at first: weather changes, childhood memories, favorite hymns. Gradually, their conversations deepened, touching on dreams and fears, shared faith and future hopes. One evening, as they passed the spot where Logan had found her in the snowstorm, Hallie reined her horse to a stop. "I was so afraid that night," she admitted, "not just of the storm, but of everything I thought I knew about you." Logan nodded solemnly. "Fear can blind us worse than any blizzard, but God sees clear through it all." "He does indeed," Hallie agreed, thinking how far they'd come from that fearful night. The town watched their courtship with growing acceptance. Even those who had lost family in the fire saw how Logan carried his responsibility with humble grace. He never made excuses for the past, but his actions showed a man transformed by repentance and mercy. Martha and Sarah Bell helped Hallie plant a small garden behind the schoolhouse. As they turned the thawing soil, Martha shared stories of Logan's kindness through the years, how he'd given up his own meals to feed her, how he'd traded his father's gold watch for medicine when she was sick. "He's got a gentle heart," Martha said, pressing seeds into the dark earth. "It just got buried under guilt for a spell." Hallie found herself looking forward to Logan's visits to the schoolhouse. He would arrive near day's end, usually bearing some small repair that needed attention. The children grew to expect him, running outside to show him their letters or sums. He listened to each one seriously, praising their progress with quiet sincerity. One afternoon, little Sarah Jenkins tugged at Logan's sleeve. "Teacher says you're going to marry her," the child announced. "Will you still fix our schoolhouse when you do?" Logan knelt to the girl's level, his eyes twinkling. "Reckon I'll have even more reason to keep it sound and strong." The weeks passed steadily, winter's grip loosening day by day. Logan worked alongside the townsmen, his capable hands always finding ways to help. He repaired the church steps, patched the livery stable roof, and helped clear winter debris from the streets. Silas Crowell's trial was set for late spring in the county seat. Logan and Hallie both knew they would need to testify, but they faced that challenge together now, strengthened by shared purpose and faith. Their courtship continued under Reverend Bell's guidance. Each Sunday after services, they would join the Bell family for dinner, then spend the afternoon in quiet conversation or Bible study. The Reverend's gentle wisdom helped them build their relationship on solid ground. Marriage isn't just about love, he counseled them. It's about growing together in faith, supporting each other through all seasons. As March drew to a close, Logan spent several days working alone in his cabin. He would not tell Hallie what he was doing, though his eyes held a quiet excitement whenever she asked. Martha just smiled and shook her head, keeping her brother's secret. On the first Sunday in April, Logan arrived at church earlier than usual. He had traded his work clothes for a clean black suit, his beard neatly trimmed. Hallie noticed his hands bore fresh scrapes and splinters, though he had clearly tried to clean them well. The morning service felt different somehow. Reverend Bell's sermon spoke of new life and restoration, of winter giving way to spring. Hallie found herself holding her breath, sensing something important in the air. After the final hymn, as the congregation began to stir, Logan stood. "Begging your pardon, Reverend," he said clearly. "Might I have a moment before folks leave?" Reverend Bell smiled warmly. "Of course, brother." Logan turned to face the congregation, his shoulders straight but his expression humble. "I thank you all for allowing me back into this community," he began. "Your forgiveness has been a gift I don't deserve but will spend my life trying to honor." He reached into his coat pocket and withdrew something small. Moving to where Hallie sat, he knelt beside her pew. In his weathered hands was a small wooden box, beautifully carved with intricate patterns of pine branches and morning glories. "Miss Hallie Mae Hollis," he said, his voice steady despite the emotion in his eyes. "You showed me that God's grace is stronger than any sin, and His love deeper than any sorrow." He opened the box, revealing a simple gold ring. "Would you do me the honor of becoming my wife?" The ring caught the morning sunlight streaming through the church windows, but it was the box itself that brought tears to Hallie's eyes. She recognized the careful craftsmanship, the hours of patient work those splinters represented. "The morning glories," she whispered, touching the delicate carving. "Like the ones that grew by my parents' porch." Logan nodded. "I remembered you telling me about them. Thought maybe we could plant some by our own porch, if you're willing." Hallie looked up, seeing not just Logan, but the whole congregation watching with gentle expectation. Martha beamed from her pew, while Sarah Bell dabbed at her eyes with a handkerchief. Even old Mrs. Peterson wore a tearful smile. "Yes," Hallie said clearly, her voice carrying to the rafters. "Yes, I will marry you, Logan Rourke." Logan's hands trembled slightly as he slipped the ring onto her finger. Someone started humming "Amazing Grace," and soon the whole church joined in, their voices rising in joyful harmony. Reverend Bell stepped down from the pulpit, laying his hands on their shoulders in blessing. "The Lord makes all things new," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "Even hearts once broken can be reformed by His grace." As the congregation gathered around to offer congratulations, Hallie looked at the ring on her finger. It was a simple band, nothing fancy, but it shone with the promise of new beginnings. The wooden box that held it would always remind her of how love, like Logan's careful carving, could transform rough materials into something beautiful. Outside the church windows, the first crocuses were pushing through the melting snow, their purple blooms declaring winter's end. Like those hardy flowers, hope had taken root in Pine Ridge, growing stronger with each passing day. Spring crept into Pine Ridge like a gentle awakening. The last patches of snow melted beneath warm sunshine, revealing tender green shoots pushing through dark soil. Morning glories climbed the freshly whitewashed church walls, their delicate vines a testament to new beginnings. Inside the one-room church, Hallie Mae Hollis stood before the mirror in the small back room, smoothing her cream-colored dress. Martha Rourke, looking stronger than she had in months, tucked a sprig of white wildflowers into Hallie's carefully pinned hair. "You look just lovely," Martha said, her voice steady, though her hands trembled slightly from the effort of standing. The winter's illness had left her weak, but determination had brought color back to her cheeks. "Logan won't know what hit him." Sarah Bell appeared in the doorway, her eyes bright. "It's time, dear ones. The church is full." Hallie took a deep breath, clutching her father's Bible wrapped in her mother's handkerchief. Through the thin walls, she could hear the murmur of gathered townspeople. Not all had welcomed the match. Some still carried old grievances like well-worn stones, but they had come nonetheless. The piano began playing softly as Hallie stepped into the church proper. Sunlight streamed through the windows, catching dust motes in beams of gold. Logan stood at the altar beside Reverend Bell, his usually weathered face transformed by joy. He wore a new black suit that fit him awkwardly, but his eyes never left Hallie as she walked toward him. Faces turned to watch her passage, Mrs. Peterson dabbing at her eyes, the Jenkins family smiling warmly, others wearing expressions caught between acceptance and lingering doubt. Yet the very act of their presence spoke of community choosing to heal. Martha followed slowly behind Hallie, supported by young Tommy Jenkins, who'd appointed himself her special helper. She took her place of honor, chin held high despite her weakness, embodying the strength that had helped her brother endure years of isolation and shame. Reverend Bell's voice filled the small church with warmth as he began the ceremony. "Dearly, beloved, we are gathered here today not only to join these two hearts, but to witness God's grace made manifest through forgiveness and faithful love." Logan's hands were steady as he took Hallie's, though his voice shook slightly as he spoke his vows. "I promise before God and these witnesses to love you, protect you, and walk beside you all the days of my life. Where there was darkness, you brought light. Where there was guilt, you showed mercy." Hallie's clear voice carried to the rafters as she made her own promises. "I vow to love you, support you, and share in all God's blessings and burdens. You taught me that justice without mercy leaves no room for grace." As Reverend Bell pronounced them husband and wife, the spring breeze carried the scent of pine and wildflowers through the open windows. Martha wiped tears from her eyes, her smile radiant despite her fatigue. The congregation rose, and even those who had come with doubts found themselves moved by the simple power of love's triumph over bitterness. When Logan kissed his bride, the church bells rang out across Pine Ridge, their joyful pealing echoing off the mountains that had once hidden so many secrets. Now those same peaks stood as witnesses to truth revealed and hearts renewed. Spring rains softened the mountain soil as Logan's axe bit into fresh-cut timber. The old schoolhouse, weathered by decades of harsh winters, would stand strong again. Each morning, he worked alongside volunteers from town, replacing rotted boards and straightening the crooked bell tower that had leaned precariously for years. "Reckon we ought to put in new windows too," Logan said, wiping sweat from his brow. "Better light for the young ones to read by." His quiet dedication drew others to help, even those who had once shunned him. The steady rhythm of hammers and saws echoed through the pines, a chorus of redemption. Inside, Hallie arranged donated books on fresh-built shelves, her heart full as she watched children peek through the doorway, eager to return to their studies. The school had been closed through winter's worst months, but now life flowed back into its walls. She traced her fingers across a new desk, remembering her first uncertain days as teacher. Mrs. Rourke," little Sarah Jenkins called from the doorway, Pa says to tell you we found more slate boards in the old mine office." The girl beamed, proud to help restore her beloved school. Through rain and sunshine, the work continued. Logan built sturdy benches, while Martha, growing stronger each day, sewed curtains for the windows. The town's women brought baskets of food to share, and slowly, meal by meal, old wounds began to heal. As spring deepened into summer, news arrived from the territorial capital. The investigation into Silas Crowell's crimes had reached its end. Land deeds, stolen through corruption and intimidation, would be returned to their rightful owners. Families who had fled after the Great Fire began trickling back, finding welcome rather than whispers. One evening, as golden light spilled across the schoolyard, Hallie stood in her classroom preparing for the next day's lessons. Logan appeared in the doorway, his shadow long across the fresh-swept floor. "The last shingle's nailed," he said softly. "School can start proper tomorrow." Hallie smiled, remembering the broken building she'd found months ago. "It's more than just a school now," she replied. "It's proof that what was broken can be made whole." The next morning, children filled the benches, their faces bright with anticipation. Parents gathered too, standing at the back of the room as Hallie opened her Bible to read. Morning light streamed through new windows, catching dust motes like floating gold. "Let us begin," she said clearly, her voice carrying to every corner of the restored room. "With gratitude for this new day." Logan watched from outside, not wanting to intrude but unable to leave. Through the open window, he heard his wife's voice leading the children in their lessons. Where once he had known only isolation, now he felt the warm embrace of community. Where destruction had reigned, new life took root. The mountain school stood proud again, its bell tower straight against the summer sky. Around it, gardens sprouted in soil enriched by pine needles and thyme. Children's laughter rang across the schoolyard, replacing the heavy silence that had hung over these hills for too long. In town, the clerk's office worked steadily, processing returned deeds and recording proper ownership in thick ledgers. Justice, though long delayed, finally flowed like the spring-fed streams down the mountainside, bringing renewal to parched places. The seasons turned like pages in a well-loved book. Spring melted into summer, autumn painted the mountains gold, and winter's white blanket softened Pine Ridge's rough edges. Through it all, the town found its rhythm again, healing slowly but surely. Logan stood in the clearing where he often taught the older children about wilderness skills. Afternoon sun filtered through the pines, casting long shadows across fallen logs where his students perched, listening intently. Today's lesson was one that carried special weight in his heart. "Fire's a gift," he explained, his voice steady as he arranged stones in a careful circle. "But like any powerful thing, it needs respect." The children watched, some taking notes in small tablets, others helping gather kindling under his guidance. Sarah Jenkins, now a year taller and wiser, raised her hand. "Is that why you always check the wind first, Mr. Rourke?" Logan nodded, demonstrating how to test the breeze with a dampened finger. "Wind can carry sparks further than you'd reckon. One stray ember can set a whole forest ablaze." His words held no bitterness now, only the quiet wisdom of hard-learned lessons. He showed them how to clear the ground, scraping away pine needles and leaves until bare earth formed a safe boundary. Each step was deliberate, each explanation careful and clear. The children helped dig the shallow pit, their small hands working alongside his larger ones. "Nature gives us signs," he continued, pointing to the dry grasses nearby. "You've got to read them proper. Too dry, too windy, those are warnings to heed." The familiar weight of responsibility settled on his shoulders as he struck the match, but it no longer crushed him. Instead, it steadied him. The small flame caught the kindling, and soon a modest campfire crackled within its stone circle. "Now comes the most important part," Logan said, meeting each child's eyes in turn. "Never leave until you're sure it's out." He demonstrated how to douse the flames properly, explaining how deep embers could smolder for days. The children helped him scatter water across the cooling ashes, then stirred them with sticks until steam no longer rose. Finally, Logan pressed his palm against the wet earth where the fire had been, teaching them to feel for hidden heat. "Your hands tell the truth," he said softly. "Sometimes what looks safe on top still burns below." After the lesson, as the children gathered their things to head home, little Tommy Parker lingered. "Mr. Rourke?" he asked hesitantly. "Pa says you used to be afraid of fire. Is that true?" Logan knelt beside the boy, considering his answer carefully. "Not afraid exactly," he replied. "More like I learned to respect its power. Sometimes our hardest lessons teach us best how to help others." The boy nodded solemnly, understanding more than his years might suggest. "Like how you teach us to be careful?" "That's right," Logan agreed, rising to his feet. Together they checked the fire pit one final time, making absolutely certain no warmth remained. As they walked back toward town, Logan glanced over his shoulder at the clearing. Where once flames had brought destruction, now they served to illuminate wisdom. The weight of his past sin had been transformed, through grace and time, into something that might keep others safe. Through the cabin's frost-edged window, Hallie watched evening settle over the mountain. Fresh snow drifted down in lazy spirals, catching the golden glow from their lamplight. The sight no longer brought memories of that terrible storm, but instead reminded her of God's grace, how he could transform even the harshest elements into something beautiful. The wooden floor creaked softly as Logan's familiar footsteps approached. He paused beside her chair, his rough hand gentle on her shoulder. Without words, they shared the peaceful moment, watching winter's quiet descent. "Reckon it's time for evening prayers," Logan said softly, his voice warm with certainty that had replaced old guilt. Hallie nodded, reaching for their well-worn Bible, the same one that had survived the fire all those years ago. Its leather cover was smooth from daily use, its pages marked with both old tears and new joy. Together they knelt by the hearth. The flames cast dancing shadows across their bowed heads as Logan's deep voice lifted in grateful prayer. Hallie's fingers found his, weathered palm against weathered palm, their shared strength built on mercy's foundation. Peace settled over them like a warm blanket, hard-won but lasting. Here in their mountain home, faith had transformed old wounds into wisdom, hatred into healing. The snow continued falling outside, no longer a threat but a blessing, each flake a reminder that God's grace, like the seasons, made all things new. Thank you for listening. Stories connect us in the most unexpected ways. If you felt that spark today, make sure you're subscribed. I share a new one daily, and the next might change your day.